So what can you do and when? You've heard a lot of things about where we stand, where governments stand, what can be expected, what can't be expected, both from the UK government and from other representatives. Well, we thought we could synthesize it in 3 sort of steps. The first step is to assess, and if you've not started to do that, but I think today's conference is probably part of the process, you should really, really urgently start to do that. So assess your level of exposure, and bear in mind it's not just your direct level of exposure. I've heard some companies, large companies, that were based in the EU were saying, oh well, you know, I'm not really that involved in the UK market, therefore I'm not exposed. And I've heard some companies say, yeah, well, you know, Brexit is for the others, I'll be fine. Make sure you know that you will be fine, make sure you know where you are exposed, make sure that you're aware of your indirect exposure. So what you might not be exposed directly, but do you know all your suppliers? Do you know the suppliers of your suppliers, your customers, your transport providers? And bear in mind, sometimes you might sign a contract with the transport provider who's not actually the entity performing the transport operation. So everyone in this chain, and it can be extremely complex, needs to be part of your mapping exercise. You can't do that in isolation. So you need to really see the impact on your supply chain and logistics partners. You need to really understand also what are the opportunities, if any. I guess for some companies that provide, for instance, custom support services and so on, there might be some opportunities. Entities in the warehousing business might be starting to see some opportunities as well. And perhaps it's just the fact that, you know, you're going to review all your processes, you're going to better understand your flows. That might be an opportunity in itself, because it allows you to review a process and see whether you can improve them and make them more efficient and resilient going forward. The second step really is to train and plan. So once you've done the first one, which is to assess where you are, essentially, you need to start developing contingency plans. And again, you cannot do that on your own. You need to do that if you're a retailer or a manufacturer with your logistics companies, with your transport companies, and they need to also do their homework with all their suppliers, subcontractors, and providers. You need to review your options. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's all very well to think, oh, maybe I should increase my stock, because at the moment my lorries or the lorries of my service provider are my stock. But that's probably not going to be a very viable option going forward. So what would you need in order to be able to have the warehousing capacity that might be required? Where would you put it? Would you need to build new ones, or would you be asking a service provider to loan you some space in theirs? Do you want that to be customs bounded? How long are you going to need for the planning, purchasing the land if you need to do that? Do you have the money to do it? Is it financially feasible? And how long will you need for all the customs procedures as well? So this is just an example, but that's really what we mean by review your options. And know how much time you're going to need for every single step. Because you could decide to wait until everything is clear, and I can pretty much predict that we'll be back here in 6 months and you'll probably still be waiting. Or you can take matters into your own hands and decide, okay, I don't have to do anything concrete or spend any money right now necessarily, but at least I will know what it is I want to do, what are my options, and how long it would take me, so that if something is very urgent and is going to take time, I can decide whether I want to take the risk or not to do it or to leave it to later. Understand your role and responsibility. We heard that even hauliers, so even subcontractors, the guys that you as a shipper might not necessarily be directly in contact with, will also have a customs role to perform going forward. So this is very important that everyone in the chain understands what their role and responsibility could be in the worst case scenario. Make sure that when you have, of course, the available personnel, that you can train them. There are some things that we already know. We know what the Union Customs Code looks like. We know what special procedures and so on look like. There might be some simplifications on the way from HMRC, but they're not there yet. So don't wait for that. It might come, and it will make your life easier, but it might also not come. Decide whether you want to recruit, how many people, when, because that will help you later on to plan, because very often companies have to plan that a year in advance. Make sure you know whether you want to outsource, and if you want to do that, don't wait until the last minute, because a lot of people will suddenly be going to logistics companies and others to ask them to take care of their situation, but these companies will be faced by a lot of demand at the same time. And then implement, so choose your preferred path, inform your staff and partners, and make sure that you can implement changes, whether they are IT related, real estate related, logistics or production related. And it's not letting me move to the next one.
Can we move the slide on, please?
So it seems that this is all you need to do. No, not really. There are more. Oops. There you go. So what can you do at a basic level? You can review your level of exposure. You can work on the basis of the worst case scenario. I admit that not everyone will be able to plan for every possible option and scenario under the sun, although it seems from the little doodle we did this morning that more than expected are actually planning for various scenarios. So if you don't know, plan for the worst, and that way you will be better equipped and better prepared if things are better and easier. Make sure you work with your suppliers, clients and service providers, take them by the hand if needs be, and force them to work with you on this, because this is really, really important, especially if they are based in other countries. As you've heard, this is not really the number one matter for everyone in the world at the moment. So you might need to really help them understand the challenges and work with you on solutions. Review your logistics, sourcing, regulatory, customs, tax and HR implications. There could be HR implications, I'm sorry to say. For instance, if you are relying on agency workers who are not permanent residents in the UK, they are not covered by the deal of December last year. They wouldn't be covered by the withdrawal agreement. It's up to the UK government to decide whether or not they can come, on which basis, and that has not been decided yet. So you need to be aware of that. And obviously consider any opportunities you might see. In terms of sourcing and rules of origin, you need to understand that trade deals are not just about tariffs or zero tariffs. You need to demonstrate you can qualify for the zero tariffs or the tariff reductions. And how can you do that? Well, you need to demonstrate that a substantial part of your products were actually produced, well, in the UK in this case. If you have a big part of your products that have been produced in other countries in the European Union, it might not necessarily qualify in the future towards the UK content. So you need to make sure that you're familiar at least with the basics of what rules of origin mean, because that's very important to understand the implications on your supply chains. You will find in the presentation a useful link to the, I think it's the Commission website, this one, that will tell you a little bit how that works. And you need to ask yourself some questions. So where do you source your components and ingredients? Are you able to provide proof of origin if needs be? Do you know where your suppliers source their materials and products? And if you don't, well, perhaps it's time you ask them. Trade agreements with third countries. So we're hoping, obviously, that there will be a transition period, that the political agreement will be translated into something tangible, and we're hoping that the UK will remain covered by these trade agreements, but that will not last forever. There will come a point where the UK will want to negotiate its own trade deals. But all of this is still a little bit uncertain, so you need to ask yourself, do you import or export from countries benefiting from a trade agreement with the EU, or that are covered by the preferential agreements with developing countries, everything but arms, GSP, GSP+. These are arrangements that either substantially reduce the tariffs on goods coming from developing countries, or whereby there are no tariffs. So you need to know that, because we're hoping that the UK government will replicate all that, but it's not an absolute certainty that it will be done in time. There are some actions for shippers, including retailers and manufacturers, on what to do supply chain-wise. You need to know how resilient your supply chain is to potential border delays. So you need to ask yourself, every time you look at a different product, or production process or distribution process, what would happen if the trucks or whichever means of transport is bringing them to my distribution center or production plant were delayed by 20 minutes, by 2 hours, by half a day, or even longer. You need to ask yourself these questions and see which ones are the most vulnerable or time sensitive, because that will lead you to different solutions later on. You need to know how you will manage disruptions if it comes to that. And you can only know that if you know how sensitive you are to potential disruptions in the first place. You need to assess transport options with your service providers. We are obviously very much hoping there will be an agreement both for aviation, for road transport and for rail. But if that's not coming straight away, how are you going to cope? You need to think of potential alternatives. It's not going to work for every single product or chain. In fact, in many cases, perhaps it won't. But unless you ask yourself the question, you will be faced with a dilemma. You need to bear in mind possible access points restrictions for certain types of products. So we were talking earlier about sanitary and phytosanitary checks. Well, checks are one part of the challenge. The other part is that, as per EU rules, there are certain products that can only enter the EU market through border inspection posts. Not every single port or infrastructure node is equipped with these border inspection posts. So if you're carrying things like dairy products, meat, fish, or some fruits and vegetables, for instance, even if you are carrying things like noodles with meat or pasta sauce or anything that has a little bit of these products in, you need to be very mindful of the fact that you might no longer be able to use the routes you are using at present unless the relevant infrastructure is put in place. It's bad news. I'm sorry about that, and I hope it will not be needed. I hope there will be a waiver for all of these checks and requirements, like Switzerland. But if it's not the case, you need to factor that in your planning. You need to bring your processes and data keeping in line with international trade standards. So one thing we hear very often, both from customs in particular, but also hauliers and others, is that the data keeping the processes are perhaps not as stringent, precise and robust when you're dealing with intra-EU trade and when you're dealing with the rest of the world, because you don't have the same requirements from an administrative purpose. Well, try and ask yourself, what would it take to be as robust, as precise, as detailed as you are with your trade with the rest of the world? And if you're a logistics provider, well, you have actions too. So how would you manage potential delays and disruptions on behalf of your customers? What are your backup plans? What is it that you can offer them in practice if there are specific problems, hopefully on a temporary basis, at particular points? You could have new responsibilities post-Brexit, even if the only thing you do at this point is pick up the goods, transport them, and deliver them. Under the customs code, there are certain responsibilities that you'd have to take into account. The summary entry and exit declarations, for instance. Do you have everything you need to fulfill potential new obligations? Do you have the skills, the resources, the knowledge to do that? Do you have the data from your customers as well, the information you need? If not, you need to warn them in advance that you're going to be needing that potentially in the future. Ensure that all your EU drivers have full passports, because identity cards from other countries at the moment are accepted. It might not necessarily be the case in the future, so you need to consider that. And consider emergency backup solutions. So we don't think that restrictions to transport, if they ever occurred, could last for very long. For political reasons, the outcome would just be too big, probably. But what if there were huge problems? How are you going to manage that? From a customs point of view, and I won't go too much into detail because you've got a wonderful set of presentations and insight already, but just make sure you increase your understanding of the Union Customs Code and what it means in practice. And there are some very good guidance pages on the UK government websites where it tells you how to apply for specific things, for special procedures and so on, how it works, what are your responsibilities, what to do if you're importing or exporting for the first time. We're hoping it will be easier, but if it's not, at least you will know, you have a basic understanding of what to do and what's expected. Are you familiar with customs special procedures like temporary storage, inward and outward processing? Do you know what it means? Do you know what you can do with it? Do you know how it could help you as part of your production process? And do you know what will be required of you as well in terms of documents, whether you need to be EU accredited or not, robustness of data and so on, even guarantee or not? Are you going to be able to raise guarantees as well? And if not, will someone else be able to do it on your behalf? Because most of these special procedures actually come with guarantees attached, so you need to bear that in mind. For some of these procedures, there could be alternatives. You have the FTA carnet, for instance, if you want to bring some goods for an exhibit in the EU in the future, or if you want to bring a car for testing in the EU, but you're not actually doing anything to the car in terms of further processing, that could be an alternative to some of these special procedures. We're hoping that the UK will sign up to the Common Transit Convention in time, and I think this is also everyone's intention, both on the EU and UK government side. But if that's not the case, consider that there are some alternatives. There's TIR as well, that we can sell, although obviously it's not our preferred option. Consider becoming EU accredited if you think it makes sense for you, and I think the presentation you had this morning should help you to decide whether you think it's appropriate for you or not, whether it's worth it. Ask yourself whether you know how to classify your products. There was an interesting story in the press this morning about chicken coming from Ukraine and European farmers being absolutely furious because it seems that Ukrainians are managing to get chicken into the European Union without paying the right duties. Well, they do that because they know how to classify their products and they find a way of classifying them so that they don't pay any duties. Now, I'm not suggesting you should try to do that necessarily. What I'm saying is it matters, it's very important, and you need to understand how it's done. Because there are tons and tons and tons of categories of products. You think it's just simple chicken, but there would be, I don't know how many categories, probably more than 6, 7, or 8 categories of chicken. And it's the same for every other product. Consider your regulatory, tax, and cash flow actions. So from a regulatory point of view, this is very important. What are the rules that apply to third country entities in your sector? For instance, if you're in the chemical sector or you're regulated by REACH, you need to know exactly what a third country can do, what role they can perform as part of that, and what role they can no longer perform, because you might have to cede some of your responsibilities to some of your partners in the supply chain. Are new documents needed, like health certificates or certificates of compliance, demonstrating compliance with EU rules in terms of product safety, for instance? What about border controls and possible restrictions? Obviously, we've talked about customs, we've talked about sanitary and phytosanitary checks. There are many, many other. I'll refer you kindly to our reports, which will be in your packs when you leave. We've tried and map some of it. It's very far from being close to the reality, probably, but you need to bear that in mind. The tax and cash flow implications as well. Assess the cash flow and financial impact of most favored nation tariffs. These are the default tariff levels at WTO. So the EU ones are known, of course, so try and see what that would mean for you should it come to that. The new VAT rules, rules of origin, try to see what that means in financial terms for you. Factor in any cost related to regulatory compliance, So obviously inspections, you'd have to pay for it. So I think that the sanitary inspections we are talking about, certainly in some countries, I think it's the case in France, you've got to pay for it as well. The certificates and so on, bear in mind all of this is not free to produce, and all of it is not necessarily free also from a relationship with the administration perspective. Consider applying for a deferment account. So there are various things you can do. And we've been talking a lot about border delays. What can you do to manage potential border delays? You need to ask yourself some questions, first of all. So we're not saying you need to spend a lot of money right now necessarily, but ask yourself the question, do you need to increase your inventory or buy additional storage space? Can you put the cash flow contingencies in place for any additional inventory costs? Again, it's not necessarily about spending the money right now, it's about making sure you'll have it if you need it. Review your storage options and consider investing in warehousing. Understand customs options and possibilities, because if you apply for special procedures under UCC, you could also do some processing in these warehouses. While all the duties and so on are suspended until you decide where you want to send your products, if you have various delivery points in different custom zones. Make sure you understand time constraints and stay tuned, obviously. If you are an FTA member, we have monthly webinars, James will talk about that in a minute, and many other channels to keep you updated. And last but not least, manage your EU workers and know exactly, again, what's your exposure. You need to know what's the percentage of UK workforce from EU 27 countries. Ireland might have a different treatment because of the common travel area. But you need to know that. You need to know whether you employ any agency workers, either directly or whether your subcontractors or service providers might employ them. Are they residents in the UK or not? And that's a tricky question to answer in many cases because you don't actually have a relationship with them, but it's an important one to ask all your service providers because some of these will be covered by the political agreement of December of last year and hopefully the withdrawal agreement in the future whenever this is ratified. But some will just not be covered by that. And then again, it's up to the UK government's future immigration policy. Make sure you understand and communicate the situation to your staff. You can follow official UK government guidance. I have to say, to be honest, that this is perhaps one of the areas where the UK government has indeed produced a bit of guidance. So they haven't done it for everything, but for this they have. You can register for updates, and you'll find here the link if you want to do that. And take action. Eventually, review training and recruitment needs, consider options to retain the existing workforce and attract new talents. We're all facing, in the logistics industry, a massive shortage of skills, not just for drivers, also in warehousing and also in other functions. So you will all want to make sure that you are the best possible companies and to convince your workers to stick to you and stay with you in face of the uncertainty, because that will reduce your problem later on. And consider making use of apprenticeships as well. So I will now hand on to James to tell you more about what FTA is doing.
If what you've heard today has made you feel angry or interested or concerned, then make sure you stay in touch with us and help us to shape the way the future will look. We have a very deep and very well-established democratic process. Our British Shippers Council, insofar as it represents key stakeholders in the export and import sector, and the retailing and manufacturing sector in particular, is a key focus point for decisions at the moment, but so will our other freight councils as decisions are made and implications become clear in the other modes. We have a dedicated customs working group, and just as soon as HMRC and indeed continental and Irish agencies start to release information about how Brexit will actually play out, these will be the groups which will be considering what is proposed, feeding back and interpreting what is being said. We also have a European Road Freight Operators Network, and that is run from our Brussels office. And again, as the procedures for vehicle permits and recognition of vocational licenses and qualifications becomes more clear, that will be the principal body which will assess and influence the shape of those. So that's where we'll be seeking to decide what our policy is and how we can influence. But there's clearly a lot of information to come forward. We've been running our monthly Brexit webinars, details of which you'll find on the FTA website, since August 2016, so as soon as the referendum result was declared almost. And Pauline and Sarah in our Brussels office devised what is probably the most comprehensive source of update and insight on the way the negotiations are going from an EU point of view through our weekly Brexit digest. If you're not party to either of those two channels of information, please do speak to any of the FTA staff that are here today or log on to the website at fta.co.uk/Brexit and do sign up there. And if you are in the European road transport markets, please take note of 3 dates that we are announcing today for our European Transport Manager seminars, aimed particularly at international road transport operators. We've scheduled these for September, as you can see there, across the country, and we sincerely hope by then we will have the next generation of information for you about how exactly international haulage is going to be managed and delivered after Brexit. 2 particular issues that have come up today I want to announce as well is a capability that FTA is launching with some of our partners, the first of which is in the field of customs classifications. We are today announcing with our friends and colleagues at Customs Support, and you've been hearing from Tom a little bit earlier on, a service that we will offer through our consultancy business in order to help businesses that follow Pauline's advice from earlier and are attempting to make classifications of their goods under the EU Customs Code. This service will help them do that. Now, as Pauline said, and the Ukrainian chicken producers are the case in point, this is not only a challenging task, it can also save you or cost you a lot of money if you don't get it right. Customs Support, as Tom was explaining earlier, a very well-established business on the continent of Europe, and their knowledge and understanding of EU customs procedures is unparalleled. And from the point of view of British exports needing to enter the single market after Brexit, a classification under the EU Customs Code, the Union Customs Code, will be required. And at the last count, there were over 140,000 British businesses that only dealt with the EU and therefore, in theory, may not have ever had to make a customs classification in a generation. So this could be a very important step to take. And importantly, because we obviously know that after Brexit, the European Customs Code will continue to be in force, this is a good investment of time now so as to avoid the bottleneck and the rush closer to actual Brexit day. So that is a service we will be bringing to market in the next few weeks. Stay tuned to the website and other channels of information for updates on that. So even if you have your customs classification made, as you've been hearing, the other major concern might be, so how do you actually deliver it to market? And in partnership with our friends at PTV, a major supplier of routing and scheduling software, we are also seeking to make available to FTA members the benefits of their considerable capabilities in modelling supply chains and routes to market, literally, through their data holdings. And this is not just going to be simply Google Maps reinvented. This is a unique data set of routes, timings and costs in not just the road mode, but also in the rail and short sea shipping mode as well. And as you can see from the illustration there, if you're thinking through how you might change and re-engineer your supply chains in the light of the changes of Brexit, this could be a particularly powerful and capable tool, particularly for the smaller businesses in the FTA membership, which might not have ready access to this kind of software and intelligence. So again, more information and details on these services through the consultancy business will be made available as we go through the next few weeks. Now, FTA is also extremely well connected. We've been hearing from Aidan earlier on about the very important role that FTA Ireland is playing voicing the concerns and the anxieties of Irish business to the Irish government and border agencies, and working with Pauline and Sarah in Brussels. I can also tell you that by virtue of the special status of Ireland as continuing to be a member state of the EU, we've also been able to get those messages and concerns heard in the very highest places in the European Commission. FTA is also a member of, and indeed provides a secretariat for, the Global Shippers Forum. So as the global opportunities begin to arise from Brexit, which we hope are not too far away, we will be able to ensure that those are maximised for members, particularly in respect to the ocean and air markets. And in terms of joining all the dots up in Europe, FTA's Brussels office continues to be playing a major role, together with other partners on the continent, in voicing the concerns of pan-European supply chain operators and users. We are going to be with you on this journey over the next few weeks and months, and I hope you will see there not just only a capability in terms of knowledge and in understanding, but also the emergence of new real member services. But of course, the real difference that I think FTA can make is in terms of the people that it is bringing to bear on this particular problem. So in addition to myself and Pauline, who you've been hearing from all day, I would just like to take 1 minute just to introduce you to the other members of the FTA Brexit team. So sat at the back there, but contributing a lot to a lot of the information is Sarah Hardy. Please stand up, Sarah, make sure everybody knows you. Sarah's looking after the interests of European road freight operators in particular. And so if you want further information about those international road haulage seminars, please talk to Sarah before you leave. I'd also like to introduce Alex Veach, if he's managed to come back this afternoon. Well done, Alex, good. Let me tell you, Alex is currently on just completing a long-term secondment to HMRC, where he has been helping the cause, helping the effort. I'm very pleased to say, though, Alex will be returning full-time to FTA. In addition to his responsibilities on global level, clearly he's going to be bringing a lot of insight and knowledge of government from the time that he spent in the depths of HMRC, while of course respecting the terms of the non-disclosure agreement that he signed, and I'm certainly keeping my eye on the Official Secrets Act, so don't worry, we're not going to be doing anything too risky. Also my great pleasure to introduce to all of you for the first time today Mr. John Lucy, who is sitting over here on your left. John is joining us at the end of July to take on a particular role in managing information flows and dissemination of information about international trade and transport procedures. John has a long, distinguished, dare I say, John, career in working with some of the major international logistics businesses in the country. He's currently with Denom Transport and spent a lot of time with Davis Turner, but joining the full-time FTA team as of the end of July. Really pleased to have you on board, and that will give us important new capabilities and knowledge and experience in what's clearly going to be a very, very important topic of leadership and discussion going forward. So we are feeling we're fit for the future. All we need to do now is to work out what's going to go on, and I'd just like to leave you with a few last thoughts about where we see ourselves at this point in the process. So what actually happens next in this long, drawn-out political process? Well, here we are, sitting in London on the 20th of June at the FTA Brexit conference. And as you've heard from the Minister, and indeed others, the next major milestone is next week, when the Prime Minister, together with all the other heads of European governments, assemble in Brussels for the latest in the series of EU summits, at which supposedly the Brexit agreements and so on are supposed to be finalised, and that clarity that we've long been looking for might actually start to come through. But as the Minister made clear, and as also as the general noise in the background has been informing us in Brussels and Westminster for some time, we don't think this June Council is going to produce the breakthrough that we had wanted and that had been expected. And certainly our expectations have been played down. We've been told not to raise our hopes, and it was largely off the back of that disappointment and frustration, the breakthrough not being made, that we voiced our particular concerns a couple of weeks ago about not enough progress being made quickly enough to really address some of the concerns here. Now, The reason why the progress isn't being made, let's be honest, is because the British government can't agree what its position is with the European Union, never mind get it cleared through the British Parliament or indeed with the European Union. And on her way to the G7 summit the other weekend, the Prime Minister announced that she would be convening a meeting of her cabinet at Chequers, the Prime Minister's weekend residence, where they will agree, I think that means thrash out, what exactly the UK-EU relationship will be going forward. And to put it in very blunt terms, that is it going to be the new customs partnership model, or is it going to be the highly streamlined or maximum facilitation model? That disagreement broke out publicly in the media a few weeks ago. It's still not been resolved, but clearly the Prime Minister is committed to getting an answer, banging some heads together. We believe that meeting will take place the weekend of the 7th, 8th of July, but importantly, after the Council. That means that coming back to work on Monday, the week commencing the 9th of July, there are three things that need to happen and probably will. The first is, and you heard the Minister talk about it this morning, that the most important document on Brexit published since the referendum, and they were his words, will be issued by the government, setting out formally and comprehensively what it is the UK wants in its future relationship with the European Union. So as they pick up the pieces and bandage the wounds and consign the walking wounded to hospital from the cabinet meeting at Chequers, there will be clarity, so we're assured, on what the UK government's position is, and that will be published, we expect, the week commencing the 9th of July. The other commitment that the Prime Minister made on her way to Canada and the G7 was that at that time, the customs and trade bills, so the draft legislation that is currently before the Houses of Parliament to give the government the necessary powers to enact in these areas, these will return to the House of Commons. And this isn't just a piece of minor formality. It is these bills which will be voted on and will determine whether or not, amongst other things, the UK will have to stay in some kind of customs union. These are all the things that were in the papers a few weeks ago. The government managed to avoid the showdown votes at that time, but the problem hasn't gone away. These bills will need to be voted on because the government needs to have the powers to act, but it will also crystallise the political disagreement, and the key votes, it will be in the House of Commons probably in that week. But the real test as to whether or not there is a satisfactory understanding of what the UK wants from the European Union will of course be the way that the European Union itself reacts. And if there is to be a serious prospect of agreement and breakthrough to give us as the logistics industry the kind of clarity that we need, it will be really important, absolutely essential, that UK white paper is actually landed with the European Union in a way that they are prepared to talk about it. And let's be clear, if that white paper is dismissed in a tweet from Michel Barnier as being unacceptable or something similar, then we really will be in some trouble. So the real test will be, has the groundwork been done in the background to ensure that what is in the white paper is acceptable to the European Union and we can move on to the next stage. The reason for that rush and for everything to be compressed into such a short space of time is that the House of Commons rises for the summer recess on the 20th of July. So although it may not all happen in the week of the 9th, it needs to be complete by the time the House of Commons breaks for the summer. And that's quite important because assuming that the boxes are ticked on the list above, then the grunt work can be undertaken to try to get us into a position to be agreeing all of this by the next EU Council meeting, which will be the 18th, 19th of October. There is a lot of work to do. This is getting uncomfortably close. I pointed out to ministers that by the third week in October, the logistics industry, certainly in the consumer goods sector, is full on with delivering Christmas. So management bandwidth and attention span isn't quite what it is at this point in the year. So we're already fully and busily occupied. And of course, we are another 3 to 4 months closer to the given date of Brexit. So if there isn't going to be a breakthrough, we've lost a whole summer of planning if we don't take action now. And the reason why October has been identified as the key date is because in order for the respective parliaments in Brussels and in Westminster to be given their say on the withdrawal agreement, then that's quite lengthy parliamentary process and needs to be got underway at the very latest by November, going possibly into February. This is part of the ratification procedure, which allows everything to be in place for when the UK official leaving date of the 29th of March takes place. That will, of course, hopefully include the fact that although the UK has technically left the European Union on the 29th of March, there is that transition period that kicks in until the end of 2020, which means that as far as trade is concerned, everything stays the same. So it gets a little bit hung up on the semantics there of the dates and the legal status, but that's the sequence of events that needs to take place. And I have to say at this stage it doesn't look good, because overnight, reacting to various other debates and dialogues that have taken place, Michel Barnier himself was suggesting that the prospects for an agreement by October were beginning to look a little bit slim, and we started to see, horror of horrors, the prospect that it might not even be done then, and we might even be looking at a date that I couldn't fit on there because it had gone off the bottom of the page, and that's the December EU Council. And of course that gives us barely 90, 100 days before the intended date of Brexit, and that really, really is leaving it until the last minute in logistics terms. So that's what's coming and confronting us for the rest of the year. We have a huge amount of work to do, but I do hope that the conference today has given you a unique and privileged insight to where we are, what the challenges and the opportunities are, and particularly how you might start to think about approaching them in your business. I'm very pleased with the level of engagement that we've had. In terms of how the day went, well, I can tell you the minister's not happy. The minister confided to us on his way out of the building that he felt a little bit sort of bounced into the situation. He thought we were being a little bit aggressive. He thought that we were being a little bit strident in our demands, to which, of course, the response is, well, we're a trade association. The FTA stands up for logistics. That's what we do. Start getting used to it, because we have approached the situation, I believe, where we can no longer wait for the politicians to decide our future. We are going to have to start making our own decisions and making our own choices. And I hope what you've heard today is giving you the confidence, the advice, and the means by which you can take forward the planning that you will necessarily need to do in your business and begin to face the future with a little bit more confidence. Another really important message that came out, particularly this afternoon, is that we've been using the Keep Britain Trading tag as our conference tagline for a couple of years now. But I think the next conference that FTA organises won't be Keep Britain Traded. It will be entitled Get Europe Worried. Because judging by the reaction that our panel was giving this afternoon, I think there is a lot of naivety and misunderstanding in wider European businesses about the fact that they too will be potential losers from the imposition of a hard Brexit. And they too have a major job to do to get themselves into a comparable position in order to continue to keep Europe trading with Britain, never mind Britain trading with the EU. So the questions I would love to have asked our panel, and still need to ask them, is so if we do resort to permits for international haulage after Brexit, what's the allocation criteria for a limited number of permits amongst continental haulage operators? What are their criteria for handing those out? The questions that Paul O'Sullivan was asking of a British audience and of the way the British government would approach that challenge are equally relevant for every other member state of the European Union in the continent. It's not going to be a factor in Ireland. But they too need to get themselves in a position where they are able to answer exactly the same questions to their members as Paul O'Sullivan was asking us this morning. So whether it's on permits, a really important point I thought was made by Thierry was about the lack of customs skills, and quite rightly pointed out that that is a real challenge and a risk to businesses. And also, of course, that number, I think the Minister made the quote at the beginning of the day, £135 billion is the value of trade that the EU has with Britain. That's the value of imports coming into the UK from the EU. That's over 4 times the amount of money that the UK will be handing to the EU as part of the withdrawal agreement. This is a phenomenal amount of trade that goes on. And whilst it will continue, I'm suggesting that it's not going to continue, but if it continues at a higher cost and a less degree of reliability, then there will be losers from that shakeout of trading patterns, and they will be in Britain, and they will almost certainly be on the continent and in Ireland as well. So we need to get EU 27 governments and agencies cited on the fact that there is business risk for their citizens and business, as well as it being obviously a case in the EU, and that is something that the FTA will devote its energies to supporting our colleagues on the continent in Ireland to get that message across. And finally, and really importantly, because we keep leaving it to last, and I got a bit of a ticking off from our president for leaving it to last, and that's the skills issue. If we again do another conference, we kept Britain trading today. The other big challenge we're going to have to do is to keep Britain working. And the really frustrating thing is that there is a provisional agreement on exactly what the status of EU workers will be in the UK after Brexit. The Minister confirmed that categorically in his speech this morning. But what we are not in a position to do yet, because the government hasn't signed it off, is to be able to advise our members how you can write to your EU workers and confirm in a contract of employment that they will be able to continue working for you after Brexit. That's the test, that's the acid test that will need to be passed. When can employers write to employees in a binding letter of engagement and contract of employment and refresh and continue that employment relationship? And until that comes, the skills issue will continue to dominate the agenda. And on a slightly different level, but equally relevant for the government as well, I'm sure a lot of businesses in the room are paying the apprenticeship levy. Well, given the skills shortage that we evidently have in the ability to handle customs procedures and understand international trade, FTA is going to be making it, and has been making it, a priority to see ways in which that apprenticeship levy money, which you are paying at the moment to the building across the road, can be recycled back into the industry, maybe not to support apprenticeships as such, but certainly into the learning and development that you will want to expose your staff to in order to get them Brexit ready. And if that's not a sensible and logical and obvious use of government collected funds and taxation, then I don't know what is. And at the very least, of course, today's been hugely therapeutic, not least for your chairman, and both the morning and the afternoon sessions. So thank you very much indeed for your patience. I'd just like, before you go, just to thank all of our speakers this morning, and one last show of appreciation from you, our audience, for their efforts and their contributions. Can I just also acknowledge and thank the efforts of Carly and her team, my colleagues from the FTA events department, and to Rona and to Kevin, who have been looking after the press. Thanks to the tech team for keeping the lights on and the speakers working. And obviously very grateful again to our sponsors, the Port of Dover, not just for their support, but also for the really good presentation that Richard did this morning, and also to Multimodal for their support. Thank you for your attendance and your contributions. Please return your feedback forms to the registration desk as you leave. No one leaves the building with one of our keypads. Just think I'll point that out. If you've still got one of our keypads from this morning, please can you drop it in the bag on your way out. And don't forget to collect your delegate pack. There's not only some really important documents in there. A lot of what we've been talking about this afternoon has been recorded in our revised manifesto and prospectus for what we need to achieve over the next few months. There is other important information in there as well. Like any good James Bond film, Keep Britain Trading will return. We hope that we'll have a huge amount more information to be able to impart to you there. But in the meantime, stay in membership of FTA, make the most of the membership benefits that I've described. Thank you for participating. Have a safe journey home. Good afternoon.